last 45 minutes, my talk is going to be anticlimactic. I mean, I think the wonderful thing about the internet that we've discovered during the COVID crisis is that it really is a kind of both a global, a regional, and a community campfire that we can all gather around. And in this difficult time, it brings us together as a community. And on that note, I'd just like to have this opportunity to thank all of you who over the last years have welcomed Gail and I so fondly and warmly to Bowen. We're so grateful to live here, and we really feel it's a place where we'll live out our years. You know, so the opportunity to accept Joe's invitation to share a few thoughts with you on this new book. In a way, this new book is my Bowen baby. It's the first of all of my books that was conceived and written exclusively on this island. So it's wonderful to be able to share a few thoughts about it tonight. And I'll just give me a second here. I'm going to pull up and do a little share screen with you. Can you see those images, everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good.
Images.
There we go.
I can see one.
Good. I think travelers often become enchanted with the first country that captures their hearts and gives them license to feel free. And for me, it was always Colombia. Whether it was the mountains and the forests, the rivers and the wetlands, the extraordinary expanses of the Amazon, a forest the size of France, or the endless expanses of the eastern plains, the equatorial peaks, every snow enveloped mountain kind of opened a doorway to a wider world that I would spend an entire lifetime coming to know. Colombia, in a certain sense, as a Colombian friend once told me, gave me the wings to fly, if you will. And this strange affair, the love between a boy and a country and its people, began innocently enough in the summer of 1968, when my mother, who was a modest but determined Canadian woman, told me that Spanish was the language of the future. And she worked very hard all year as a secretary in an elementary school to save enough money to allow me to join a group of schoolboys that a teacher was taking to Colombia. And at 14, I was the youngest of the group and the most fortunate, because whereas the other lads spent a kind of sweltering season in the streets of Cali, Colombia's third largest city, I by chance was billeted with a much more modest family in the mountains above the city at the edge of trails that reached west to the Pacific. And for 8 or 10 weeks, I never saw any of the other Canadian lads. And it was a kind of a classic Colombian scene, children too numerous to keep track of, an indulgent father, a grandmother who muttered to herself on a porch overlooking flower beds and fruit trees, an angelic sister who more than once carried her brother and me home half drunk, to a mother kind beyond words who stood at the garden gate, feigning anger as she tapped her toe on the stone steps. And for that long summer, which is a long, long time when you're 14, and Colombia was a distant destination in a decade where most Canadians had never taken a commercial flight, let alone traveled to South America. For those long weeks, I encountered the warmth and decency of a people who seemed charged with a strange intensity, a passion for life, and a quiet understanding of the frailty of the human spirit. And ironically, whereas many of the other Canadian lads who were 2 and 3 years older than I was succumbed to what the Colombians call mamitis, or homesickness, I, by contrast, really did feel like I'd finally found home. And 6 years later, in the early spring of 1974, I returned to Colombia with a one-way ticket. I had just a small backpack of clothes and 2 books, George Lawrence's Taxonomy of Vascular Plants and Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And at the time, I literally felt that bliss was an objective state that one could achieve just by opening yourself unabashedly to the world. And both literally and figuratively, I drank from every stream, even from tire tracks in the roads. And naturally, I was constantly sick. But even that seemed part of the process, malarial and dysentery fevers that rose in the evening only to break with the dawn. Once on a day's notice, I agreed to guide an English journalist who had walked from the tip of South America, destined for the far reaches of Alaska. And the only part of his itinerary that did not have a road was the notorious Darien Gap. At the time, 250 miles of swamp and rainforest that separated Panama from Colombia. And it was an extraordinary adventure in the middle of the rainy season, walking through swamps with the water to our necks. We became at one point lost in the forest for 12 days with 3 Indians, with no food and no shelter. When we finally emerged safely, having encountered jaguars and anaconda, been chased by the military and robbed by thieves, I finally kind of reached safety in Panama City, I scrambled off a small airplane with only the ragged and rotten clothes on my back, $3 to my name, and completely drenched in vomit from the passengers, who, 2 of whom had puked on me during the turbulent passage from that small rainforest airstrip. I was totally alone, broke, nowhere to go, but I had never felt more alive in my life. And along the way, I became an acolyte of the legendary Amazonian explorer, Richard Evans Schultes, the man who sparked the psychedelic era in the 1930s with his discovery of the so-called magic mushrooms in Mexico, in Oaxaca. And then, having solved the mystery of Ololuiki, the serpent vine, he then took a leave of absence from Harvard in 1941 and disappeared into the Northwest Amazon, where he remained for 12 uninterrupted years, traveling down unknown rivers, living amongst unknown peoples, all the time enchanted by the wonder of the equatorial rainforests. In time, mountains would bear his name, as would national parks. And when years later, I would write his biography, a book called One River that came out in Canada in 1996, but not in Spanish until 2002. It came out in Spanish really as a love letter to a nation that by then was scorned by the world. 2002 marked a low point in Colombia's fortunes, and at a time when the country's very capacity to endure was being called into question. You might think that the publication of a book on botanical exploration with a print run of about 500 copies would hardly warrant attention. But the great secret to the book, as it turned out, was the elegance of the translation by the late Colombian poet Nicholas Sisquan, who brought the book alive in a way that remained completely loyal to the manuscript, but presented it in a way that was completely consistent with the poetics of the Spanish language. And it came out 150 pages longer in Spanish than it did in English. In many ways, it was a book that belonged to Nicholas, and I always said that. And it was only by the time a 3rd edition of the book came out in 2009 that I had some understanding of its quixotic success. I mean, the book would go on to sell tens of thousands of copies in Colombia. It would be selected by the National Library as one of the first 25 books of the 200 destined to be selected in commemoration of the 200th anniversary of the nation, books that were the most important in the literary history of the country. And it was the only book written by a non-Colombian placed on that list. But its success lay in part because by the year 2009, when the 3rd edition appeared, Colombia had become a pariah nation. Its every citizen stained and suspect by association. Leading political figures were regularly challenged in the foreign press or lampooned by the international media. Colombia's ambassador to Washington, D.C., Carolina Barco, a former Minister of External Affairs, the daughter of a beloved Colombian president, Virgilio Barco, famously was strip searched naked at Washington's Dulles Airport simply because she held a Colombian passport. And when she presented her diplomatic credentials, the agent barked at her an obscenity as if uttered from the mouth of a dog. Now, Colombians, most of whom have never used or seen cocaine, have lived with the consequences of the trade for 2 generations. By 2012, nearly 5 million Colombians, by volition or by obligation, had abandoned their country. Within Colombia, those internally displaced numbered 7 million. Imagine how differently the Americans would feel about their war on drugs. If Canada, for example, had patterns of drug consumption in bars and boardrooms across our country, and laws that prohibited the exchange of the drug, but only facilitated the power of the mafia distributing that drug, such that fully 85 million Americans would be displaced, forced out of their homes. Well, that is exactly what happened. And the book One River, or El Rio, resonated with Colombians in part because it exposed such cruel hypocrisies, even as it painted a portrait of a land and a people completely in defiance of the dark cliches. Now, to be sure, Colombia has been convulsed for half a century by a brutal conflict that left 260,000 people dead. The missing number close to 100,000. Every family has suffered, and yet in a country of 50 million people, the actual number of combatants at any one time on all 3 sides of the conflict, the right-wing paramilitary militias, the left-wing revolutionary forces, and the federal army itself, never surpassed 200, perhaps 250,000 people. So the vast majority of Colombians were innocent victims of a war fueled almost exclusively by the unprecedented profits of the drug trade, a flood of illicit wealth that had Escobar putting 80 tons of cocaine into North America every month, generating $17 million of profit a day. His accountants in Medellin budgeted every week 1,000 US dollars simply to buy elastic bands in which to wrap the illicit cash. They would weigh the $100 bales with hay balers just to estimate the value of the wealth coming into them. And I promise you that without that black money, the struggle of the leftist guerrillas would have fizzled out decades ago. In the last year before the signing of the peace agreements in Cartagena, the negotiations having been successful in Havana, the FARC were down to 6,000 cadre, mostly teenagers in search of 4 meals a day. And yet that year before the peace, the FARC generated 600 million US dollars through extortion and drug trafficking. Well, if you give me the West Vancouver Boy Scouts and $600 million of US money, I promise you I can wreak havoc in all of British Columbia. So cocaine has been Colombia's curse, but the irony of it all is that the source plant has been known for 4,000 years as the divine leaf of immortality. To compare coca to cocaine is like comparing potatoes to vodka. And curiously, the efforts to eradicate the traditional fields of coca used by all the pre-Columbian peoples of the Andean region and the Northwest Amazon began 50 years before there was even an illicit trade in cocaine hydrochloride. In the 1920s, in Lima, Peru, physicians whose concern for the well-being of Andean peoples was matched only in its intensity by their ignorance of Andean life, looked up into the mountains and saw illiteracy, poor sanitation, social pathologies, hunger, and they had to find a cause. And because issues of land distribution, equity, economic justice, distribution of wealth came too close to challenging the bourgeois foundations of their own lives in Lima, they settled on coca as a curse and the source of all dilemmas. And the efforts to eradicate the fields began instantly. They failed, of course, because this is a plant that had been used with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, for over 4,000 years in the Andes. And incredibly, in all of that time, these physicians never bothered to do the obvious, a simple nutritional assay that would have ascertained just what these plants contained. And when finally, as part of a multi-year project that I was part of at Harvard's Botanical Museum in the 1970s, when we did the first nutritional study, what we discovered absolutely horrified our backers at the US government. Yes, coca leaves have a small amount of cocaine hydrochloride in it, less than 1%, in some varieties, half of 1% dry weight, absorbed benignly through the mucous membranes of the mouth, a benign stimulant in a harsh environment. But in addition to the small amount of stimulant, and recall, of course, that if you took the caffeine out of a coffee bean and snorted it or injected it or smoked it, you'd have a drug abuse problem. In addition to this small amount of alkaloid, the coca leaves were chock full of vitamins. So the daily consumption of coca leaves satisfied all the basic requirements for that nutrient. The leaves also had enzymes that enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, which made it perfect for the traditional tuber-based crop of and diet of the Andes. And the plant also had more calcium in it than any plant ever studied by science, which made it perfect for a diet that traditionally lacked a dairy product. So in one simple, elegant assay that could have been done at any time, we put into stark profile these draconian efforts that continue to this day to destroy the traditional fields of a plant that could, in fact, be South America's greatest gift to the world. Now, so cocaine has been Colombia's curse, but critically, the engine driving the trade has always been consumption. The cartels, of course, rose out of the country clubs and the barrios of Cali and Medellin, but the ultimate responsibility for Colombia's agonies lies clearly with everyone who has ever used street cocaine and every foreign nation that made possible the illicit trade by prohibiting the drug without curbing its use in any serious way. And after all of the violence, the rivers of blood, the tens of thousands of lives lost to murder, prison, and war, there is more cocaine consumed today than at any time in history. The American government alone, in its war on drugs, has spent over $1 trillion. And yet today, 50 years on, there are more people in more places using worse drugs in worse ways than ever before. But Colombia, of course, is not a land of violence or a land of drugs alone. In fact, it is a place of colores y cariño, of colors and love, where the people have endured and overcome years of conflict precisely because of their character, which is itself informed by an enduring spirit of place, a deep love of a land that is without doubt the most bountiful on the planet, home to the greatest ecological, geographical, and botanical in particular, and biological diversity on the planet. And it speaks volumes of the strength of the Colombian people and their resilience, that through all these impossible years of war, they have maintained civil society and democracy. They have greened their cities. They have created millions of acres of national parks. They've sought restitution with indigenous people in a way that no nation state can match. And also they've paved the way for an economic and social and cultural renaissance unimagined in the history of Latin America, as 2 generations of young people forced to flee abroad are returning with skill sets in every conceivable endeavor. Today, Colombians long for peace. Those of a certain age look back to a time when the country made sense, before the rivers, including the Mother Magdalena, was awash with the dead. And those born into the cauldron of war yearn simply for a chance to live without fear in a land where violence no longer clouds the destiny of the young. And memories and longing, I suspect, drew many readers to the narrative of El Rio, of One River, which in part recounts my experience as a young student in the 1970s, free to travel anywhere my feet would take me, from the Chocó to the Putumayo, from Cauca to the coast of Magdalena, from Nariño to the far horizons of the Llanos. And mercifully, the promise of peace has finally come to Colombia, and sooner than many imagined possible. It will be a long, slow process of reconciliation and rebirth. Sporadic violence is certainly to flare, and the corrosive influence of cocaine will remain unless governments everywhere have the courage to destroy the illicit trade with the cleansing stroke of legalization. Unfortunately, a dim prospect, despite being widely acknowledged as the only rational solution. And of course, for the nation to heal, Colombians will have to find their way to forgiveness, even as they honor always the memory of those so cruelly and unjustly taken from this life. War is easy, peace will be hard. Everybody has suffered. You know, it's amazing. Max Hastings, in one of his books, speaks of being in Moscow after the Second World War and going out to dinner and having a Russian casually say, you know, my father died in this gulag. And then another person at the dinner table chirps up and says, oh, my sister died there too, as if they had discovered that they had all gone to the same college together. Well, that's exactly what happens in Colombia. You go out to dinner and someone says, my father was killed on this paramo. Well, my sister was kidnapped there too. Everyone has suffered, and yet it's incredible that the country has found its way to peace. And today, of course, people are finally free to travel. In 2016, 20 million Colombians took to the open road, close to half the national population. And as they have begun to travel, they have awoken to an extraordinary realization: the only peace dividend of 50 years of war. And that is the fact that whereas other nations made decisions about the fate of their landscape, Ecuador, for example, that in 1970 decided to go ahead with oil extraction, building pipelines, leading to colonization, deforestation, because of the violence and the war, vast reaches of Colombia have been off limits for industrial development, whereas the Amazon forests of Ecuador have been ravaged over the last 50 years, for example. The Colombian Amazon, itself the size of France, remains today completely roadless. And so Colombians have an opportunity to make decisions about the future of their country, informed by 50 years of scientific research as to the importance of biodiversity and cultural diversity that simply did not exist when decisions were made in places like Ecuador half a century ago. And yet, as the country charts its way forward, everything hangs in the balance. This is an old friend of mine, Mamo Camilo. He's a sun priest of the Arawakus, these extraordinary 4 communities, the Cancuano, the Wiwa, the Arawakus, and the Kogi, all descendants of the ancient civilization of the Tairona that carpeted the coastal plain of Colombia until the arrival of the Spaniards. In the wake of the conquest, the survivors retreated into an isolated massif, the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta that soars to 20,000 feet, the highest coastal mountain range on earth, and isolated in the upper folds of the mountain. Over the course of 200 years, they reinvented themselves as a devotional culture of peace. And to this day, they remain ruled by a ritual priesthood. The training for the priesthood is astonishing. The acolytes are taken away from their families at the age of 2 and 3, sequestered in a shadowy world of darkness for 18 years, during which time they're enculturated in the values of their society, which maintain the proposition that their prayers and rituals literally maintain the cosmic balance of the world. And after 18 years, the acolyte is taken out to see for the first time in his life a sunrise, a horizon, a landscape. And he goes on a journey to the heart of the world, from the village to the ice of the mountains, from the ice of Saranqua back to the sea, from the sea back to the village, all the time with the priest who has trained him, saying, you see, it's as I've promised you, it's that beautiful, it's yours to protect. And so Mamo Camillo on this day said to me something really incredible in Spanish. He said, La paz no vale nada si es solamente una manera en que los varios lados del conflicto pueden unificarse para mantener una guerra contra la naturaleza. Lo que tenemos que hacer paz con todo el mundo. And what he was saying is that peace won't matter if it's only an excuse for the three sides of the conflict to come together to maintain a war against nature. It's time to make peace with the entire natural world. And as I left this settlement with Camilo, he told me that President Juan Manuel Santos, who had been the architect of peace, for which he won the Nobel Prize, was going to visit their home community of Namosimake in 5 days. And Camilo asked me if I could be there to welcome the president. And I knew that the only way I could possibly be there was to hitch a ride in the presidential plane. So I made a phone call to LA, who made a phone call to the palace. And before I knew it, President Santos invited me to join him. And we flew north. And as we flew north, his aides were peppering him with statistics for his national speech. And I interrupted him and I just told him what Mamo Camilo had said. I said, you know, Presidente, tiene que entender que los datos no valen nada para la gente. The statistics don't mean a damn to these people. What matters is what's in your heart. And he made that theme the theme of his speech. And then when we were in the sacred temple with the elders and he was introducing his party, he got around to me and he couldn't have been more effusive and generous with his remarks. But in the middle of that, one of the mamos stood up and said, no, Presidente, you don't have to introduce that guy. He's our ambassador in Washington. And that was true to the extent that whenever the delegations came up and they're highly organized politically, they would stay at our house in Washington, D.C. But with Mamo Camillo, he told me also that day that periodically the mamos made ritual payments at the very mouth of the Rio Magdalena. And that intrigued me. And I asked him if we could go and make a payment. And the next day that we did. But there's a short story by one of my favorite writers, Jorge Luis Borges, in which a European asks a Colombian professor, what does it mean to be Colombian? And the man hesitates before replying, I don't know, it's an act of faith. Well, Colombia is like that. Nothing is as expected. Many of you will have heard of magical realism as sort of Colombia's gift to Latin American literature. But, you know, Gabriel Garcia Marquez was a journalist. He was an observer, a functioning journalist all of his life who just happened to live in a land where heaven and earth converge on a regular basis to reveal glimpses of the divine. Only in Colombia can a traveler wash ashore in a coastal desert, follow waterways through wetlands as wide as the sky, pass through dense tropical forests into cloud forests that open onto verdant, bucolic alpine meadows as welcoming as anything to be found in the old world. There is no place in Colombia more removed, that is more than a day removed from every natural habitat to be found on the planet. cities as cultured as any in the Americas were for most of their history linked together only by the tracks of the arrieros, the muleteers, who carried all produce from the Mother Magdalena, the vital artery of the nation, to the cities of the hinterland. If you wanted a piano, it was dismantled and put on the back of a mule. If you wanted an electrical plant. In the 1850s and 60s, when Bogota was being described as the Athens of South America, Colombia's capital, home to great institutions of higher learning, universities, museums, botanical gardens, not to mention industrial infrastructure of what is today a city of 9 million people. Everything had to be carried on the back of a mule. And over time, this wild and impossible geography found its perfect coefficient in the topography of the Colombian spirit, restive, potent, at times placid and calm, in moments tortured and twisted, like a mountain that shakes and crumbles and slips to the sea. In Colombia, magic becomes the antidote to fear and uncertainty. Reality comes into focus through the reassuring lens of the phantasmagoric. And the Rio Magdalena is not just the country's main artery, running 1,500 kilometers south to north, shadowing, in a sense, the Mississippi itself. And like the Mississippi, it is both a corridor of commerce and a fountain of culture, the repository of Colombian literature, poetry, music, and prayer. In dark times, it has served as the graveyard of the nation, a slurry of the shapeless dead, and yet it always returns a river of life. And through all the worst years of the violence, the river never abandoned the people. It always flowed. And perhaps, as the book suggests, it's finally time to give back to the river, to allow the Magdalena to be cleansed of all that has soiled its waters, because Colombia as a nation is the gift of this river. The Magdalena is the story of Colombia, and that story today, happily, is one of regeneration, redemption, and hope. And so if we begin at the very mouth of the Rio Magdalena, at Bocas de Cenizas, we're in this pit, a spit of rocks, of riprap that goes out several miles into the sea. There's a community of fishermen who live in these bleached huts, who fish only by night, fishing with kites they make out of plastic refuge and sticks of wood to carry their hooks with a north wind far out into the Caribbean. On one side of the spit is the Rio Magdalena, brooding, death-like, the avenue of the corpses. On the other is the open sea. And as if in open resistance to despair, knowing full well that a single wave could sweep away their lives, they dedicate and decorate their homes with poetry. Here lives Beethoven. Here one breathes peace, love, and tranquility. Here one can go forward. And as I learned from Camilo, the Arawakus do make these ritual payments to the sea. They do not distinguish the blood that flows through the human veins from the water that flows through a river. And in that sense, they are intuitively and metaphysically correct, because of course we are all part of the hydrological cycle. When we die, our bodies, which are mostly made up of water, will slip as effortlessly to the sea as does the water of a river. And I also learned from the Mamos that originally in pre-Columbian times, the Arawakus would make pilgrimages to the very source of the river, walking 1,500 kilometers to the Colombian Massif, the Macizo Colombiano, the rugged knot of mountains that dominates southern Colombia, out of which emerged the three great cordilleras, the Cordillera Oriental, which forms the separation between Andean Colombia and the great eastern plains and the Amazon forest, eventually forming the frontier with Venezuela, and then driving straight up the center of the country, the Cordillera Central, which falls away to the great wetlands of the Caribbean coastal plain. And then to the west, the Cordillera Occidental, which separates the ancient forests of the Chocó from the rest of the country. The Amazon, of course, at one point flowed into the Pacific until the rise of the Andes. And so in Colombia, you have this huge chunk of forest, the size of a major state, which is in fact a forest that has evolved separately since the eruption of the Andes 50 million years ago. And as the Arawakus would move up river, they would stop in every single community to ascertain the way that that community interacted with the river. They believed that the consciousness of a people was a direct reflection of how they treated the natural world. And when they would get eventually into the macizo itself, they would make the ritual prayers to the very lake, La Laguna de la Magdalena, from where the river is born. And out of this incredible rugged knot of mountain, of course, come many of the great rivers of Colombia, not just the Cauca, the great affluent of the Magdalena, but also the Patia, which flows in the Pacific, the Putumayo and the Caquetá, the great rivers of the Amazon. As one crosses this massif, following these Incaic pre-Columbian stone roads, which fall away like mercury through the cloud forest, you reach a point where you can literally reach down. And if you're on one side of the Magdalena, which bursts like a quebrada, like a brook from the macizo, if you're on one side, you reach down and you're touching the source of the Cordillera Oriental. And if you reach to your left, if you're on the other side of the river, you're touching the birth of the Cordillera Oriental. You can literally touch, as you're walking, the foundations, the origins of a great nation. And this nation is a place of bounty. And in this mysterious way, in the same way that an impoverished young boy from Aracataca could grow to become the Nobel laureate for literature, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, so too the very bounty of the natural world has called forth from people of obscurity great scientists. My friend William Vardegas, one of the few scientists in the world who can change botanical history by holding a blossom to the light. Born in the fishing town of La Jagua, where Caldas, the great scientist, lived, a place of witches where the wind itself creates mysteries. A boy so poor he could not buy shoes, and yet today he is Colombia's greatest botanist. And once, as we moved into the macizo, he was in and out of the car like a jackrabbit. And at one point he popped back into the car with this very elegant but very showy anthurium, which turned out to be a new species to science. In Canada, for a botanist to discover a new species of plant would literally require an act of God. For collectors like William in Colombia, it's a daily occurrence. And as he brought that anthurium, a genus of some of our most common houseplants, into our Jeep, I didn't know what to think was more impressive, the precision of his taxonomic eye or the miracle of a country where such novelties could be found on the bank of a common road passing through the mountains. And these extraordinary formations unique to Colombia, the paramos, which feel like Scottish moorlands grafted onto the backs of the Andes. In the south of Peru, the heights are dry, a grassland of puna, useful just for grazing animals. But as you come north, the rainfall is ubiquitous and constant, and it creates these extraordinary concentrations of biodiversity. The key benchmark species, of course, are these extraordinary espelitias in the daisy family, known in Spanish as frijolón, because in the mist and the rain, they appear as a friar in a habit moving mysteriously across the mountains. And everywhere I went on this 5-year journey, I simply listened. It was sociology as serendipity. I would simply go to some community until I found somebody who had something to say that the world needed to hear. And that, of course, as Hemingway said, was the essence of great storytelling. This is a woman called Adelfa, 88 years old. I encountered in one of these picturesque Colombian mountain towns, in this case, Murillo. One of those towns is so beautiful that it drags you out of your bed in the middle of the night just to witness the street lights fading as dawn breaks over the promise of a new day. She was a great gaitanista, a great fan of the revolutionary hero Jorge Gaitan, who was cut down, assassinated on the streets of Bogota in 1948, the event that sparked the Bogotazo. For 6 days, Bogota burned, 6,000 died, the city was turned to ashes, and the revolutionary fervor, the battle between left and right, was underway. She said to me that God abandoned Murillo the day that Gaitan died, and he is still carved in blood upon our breasts. That's how Colombians speak. And then she said something incredible. But I was here when God returned. And then she told me the most amazing story. Murillo is exactly in the fall line of an active volcano called Navarro de Ruiz, which has been active for 2 million years, but dormant for the last 150 until 1985, when it erupted. There was no warning. The electricity went out. The ash fell like black snow. Adelpha gathered her children in the plaza of the community. The mayor had taken some to higher ground. The priest began to chant, assuring the people of their path to heaven. Everyone was destined to die. 35 million tons of ice and rock came rushing down the mountain. Murillo was right in the gravitational line of the Lathar, and yet the miracle happened. For some reason, the entire side of the mountain hit a ridge on the other side of town and soared over the entire community, such that not one person in Murillo died that day. And Adelpha said that was the day that God returned to my community. But other communities were not so lucky. Down Valley, Armero, prosperous town of 35,000, where 35,000 died that day, buried by this extraordinary volcanic eruption. Or the violence itself. Diana, who used to tell me that they would not even eat the fish in the Magdalena because the violence was so intense. And what would happen is that until Plan Colombia allowed the Colombian government to professionalize its army, it was a small army of 100,000 individuals that couldn't possibly dominate a topographical monstrosity like Colombia, as geographically diverse and complex. And the FARC and the ELN and the M19 and all the leftist groups that sprouted up and fueled themselves with the cocaine money could be anywhere and strike any time. And so the wealthy landowners, to protect themselves, created their own militias. And these militias would become murderous, accounting for 80% of the dead during the 50-year Civil War. And the reason they were so murderous was because terror was their tactic. They knew that they couldn't be everywhere, but their presence had to be everywhere. So if you bind a village to a tree and cut the men up with a chainsaw one by one, tossing the bits and pieces into the Mother Magdalena, word gets around. And the killing of the people was to kill them twice, a physical death, but by eradicating them and placing them into the river where the vultures were perched on the corpses, eating the rotten flesh as the bodies drifted downstream. You were also obliterating the individuals, making it impossible for them to have final rights, cutting them off from their spiritual destiny, the chance to enter and emerge from purgatory and be at the side of God and the divine. But there was one community that said no. The paramilitaries responsible for 80% of the murders also were the ones who said, if anyone comes to the rescue of any corpse, they will be in that river alongside it. This was the great terror. But there was one community, Puerto Barreo, a town of fishermen, where the currents of the Magdalena spin and the corpses like a vortex would gather. At first the women and then the men, one by one, said no. Bastante. And they began to take the bits and pieces of flesh out of the river. And they didn't just bury them, they adopted them. They baptized them. They became known as the Ine-Ines, those without a name, but now they had names, and they were given the names of their own loved ones who had been killed. They were baptized and brought into the circle of the church, absorbed into the family itself in this extraordinary act of grace. And it was as if the entire community had stood up against violence, against horror, and said, no, we are here. The river brought you to us, and we will not forget. It was an extraordinary act of civic solidarity and grace that inspired all of Colombia. But of course, as I'm saying, Colombia is not a land of violence. The violence was created because of our consumption of cocaine. That's end of story. It's really a place of love and music and prayer and poetry and literature, and above all, music. It's said that Colombia is a land of 1,000 rhythms. In fact, ethnomusicologists have identified 1,025. And the mother of all music is cumbia, the mother of porro, merengue, salsa, tambora. But as Carlos Vivas, the great Colombian international star, told me, and he's a great ethnomusicologist as well, the father of, or the mother of cumbia is the Magdalena. And this is what you hear all the time, that the music is in the river and the river is in the music. And without the river, the music could not sing. And throughout the central part of Colombia, in all of these communities, this extraordinary outflowing of music that results in the fact that of the 100 most popular YouTubes on the internet today, 85 are music videos, and 15 of those are Colombian music. Music is in the blood of the people, and the blood of the people is the river itself. And as we come down closer to the coast, to the Ciénaga del Rio Trato, you enter sort of the incredible biological diversity. You know, there's a surrealistic quality to the Colombian people. One of my favorite characters was a man I used to call Morita de los Manatees. He was a very poor farmer who found his power in manatees, and he became like the avatar of these extraordinary creatures. And when periods of drought would happen, he would bring hay to feed them. He found his power in these animals, and he defied all of the military. And when once the paramilitaries assaulted his community, they had the audacity to do it while he was watching the World Cup. And he just stormed out into the community and said, "How dare you? Brazil is playing Colombia." And all of the guerrillas, they weren't paramilitary, just were taken aback, and they begged if they could possibly watch the game with him. And he said, "If you put your weapons down, you can come." And Morita used to work with all the school children. And he told me one day that around this little wetland, a pond really, they had identified and collected over 75 species of butterflies. And I said, "Man, that's incredible, because in all of Canada, I mean, that's probably a third to half all the species of butterflies we have in all of Canada." And then he said something so beautiful in Spanish. He said, "Sí, pero hermano, tiene que entender que en Colombia un mariposa es solamente un flor que puede volar. Es por eso que tenemos tanto." And what he's saying is that, brother, you have to understand that in Colombia, a butterfly is just a flower that knows how to fly. That's why we have so many. And as you come down, you know, I'll give you just a sense of what all of this river means in a moment. But you come down to the greatest of all the wetlands, the Ciénaga del Grande de Santa Marta. And here in a floating village of Nueva Venecia was the site of one of the most horrific massacres during the entire war in 2003, when the paramilitaries swept in the darkness and simply slaughtered 39 men of the community. An extraordinary community, which in Colombian fashion, here the dogs are afraid of water and the cats swim. And the community has rebounded in this incredible way. And a friend of mine was doing his PhD on the power of resilience and what reconciliation could really mean in a time of war, in the shadow of war. And he told me that he interviewed a fisherman in this community. And he said, "If the government would finally give reparations for your suffering, what would you want?" And the guy said, a fisherman, "New houses." And then suddenly, as my friend was writing down some notes, he goes, no, that won't help us, will it? No, we want a revigorated wetland. If we don't have a decent ciénaga and food, what good are houses? My friend took some notes and then he was interrupted again. No, 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 that won't help. What we need is the rivers coming in, the streams coming into the wetland have to be refurbished. That will help us. And as my friend took some notes, finally the fisherman said, no, mierda, shit. What we need is nothing like that. We need the mother Magdalena to be restored. That is what we need. That is the only thing that will make up for our agonies. That will be the only thing that will bring peace to our community. And this is what the Rio Magdalena has come to mean to all Colombians. I'll just read one passage from a friend of mine, Herman Ferro, who's the director of the one museum in Colombia in the old colonial town of Honda, the height of navigation on the river, who is the head of the Museum of the Magdalena, the one museum dedicated exclusively to the river. And this is what Herman told me. A straight interview off a tape recorder. He said, and this is what peace means to the Colombian people. He said, I'll never forget the moment when I first heard that the peace agreement had been signed in Havana. By chance, I was at the very confluence of the Cauca, the great western affluent of the Magdalena, the confluence of the Cauca and the Magdalena. I was completely overwhelmed by what I can only call geographical emotion, a sense of space, as if the spirits were emerging from the earth. I stripped off my clothes and placed my head in the river. As I stood in the sun, the water dripping down my naked body, I began to weep. Rivers of tears flowed as I realized that my son could grow up in a country at peace, a river that has known every tragedy, that has carried the dead and the misery of an entire nation, that has suffered along with all Colombians, a river that I love so much. And there we were by its waters as peace came over the land. Well, this photograph tells you of the greatest danger that you will face if you travel to Colombia. 3:00 in the morning in a coastal town, two lovers practicing their salsa. The only danger in Colombia today is the distinct possibility that you will go there and never want to leave. And I want to just close with a tribute in a way to my closest friend in Colombia, Sandra Uribe, who became not just a prominent character in the book, and every character in this book had to fight to get in there. They had to represent something of the Colombian experience. And in many ways, Sandra represented the agony of the elite whose children all had to flee the country for fear of kidnapping. She was a child of Medellin at the time of Escobar's terror. When it became clear to the family when Sandra was 15 that she could not distinguish the sound of thunder from the sound of bombs, the family decided to send her to live with a grandmother in Miami. She went to Miami at 15, went to high school, and was immediately made fun of for being from the land of Escobar by Miami high school students whose main social activity was the pursuit of illicit drugs, with Colombian cocaine being the main drug of choice. Sandra, a scion of the elite of Colombia, had never seen cocaine, let alone used cocaine in her life. She returned to Colombia eventually, and her passion is expressed, believe it or not, in her love of beans. She turns beans into necklaces that are now featured in Vogue magazine. And I think what she loves about beans is not just the fact that they are, incidentally, the only major cultigen that was originally domesticated not as food but as ornament, but by the way they grow, the tenacity with which they spread, the tentacles, the tendrils reaching for the sun, the blossoms opening to the light. And every time she cultivates her hundreds of varieties of beans in her garden, she's reaching into the soil of a land that she was forced to abandon. She is reaching back to reclaim a stolen legacy, to feel the landscape of Antioquia as only a paisa, a native of the verdant slopes of that department, can possibly do. And toward the very end of our experience together, And she worked with me on all phases of the research, the editing of the book. We were together at Monserrate, this sacred retreat that soars 1,000 feet above the city of Bogota, one of the fulcrums of the sun of the ancient Muisca civilization. And she said something really remarkable. We were having chocolate and cheese together in a roadside, in a cafe, one of the elegant cafes up at the place of Monserrate. And her mind was still on the river. And she said it was a curious thing that the Spaniards had named this river Magdalena, because after all, at that time, Maria Magdalena had a less than sterling reputation. In the 6th century, in a famous sermon, Pope Gregory had besmirched the memory of Maria Magdalena by describing her as a woman of the night, a whore who only the grace of Jesus permitted her to wipe his tears with her hair, to wash her feet with her lips. But it turned out that for 1400 years, the Catholic Church focused its contempt on the wrong woman. There was a repentant prostitute in the entourage of Jesus, but that was Mary of Bethany. Maria Magdalena was neither mother, wife, nor woman of the night. She was a pure and simple devotee of Christ, just as the Gospels reveal. She stood by Jesus in his life, was there at his side during his crucifixion, was there in the shining moment when he was reborn. He specifically asked her, of all people, to carry his message, the joyful news of his rising and rebirth, because she had always been the most faithful, traveling with him in life, anointing his body in death, and sharing his message in the wake of his final ascent and passage to the side of God. And as surely as any male apostle, Maria Magdalena deserves recognition as one of the founders of the Christian church. Her very name implies power, Magdala in Aramaic, meaning tower. And she was indeed the spiritual watchtower of the world. And it wasn't until 1969 that the Roman Catholic Church formally removed the scarlet letter of sin from Maria Magdalena's name. And only in 2016, the same year as the signing of the peace agreement in Havana, did Pope Francis formally remove the scarlet letter of sin from her name and sanctify her as an apostle of the apostles, the one and only. And so, having been slandered for centuries, Maria Magdalena today is considered a saint by all Roman Catholics, all those of Eastern Orthodox faith, Lutherans, and Anglicans. In other words, as Sandra told me that day, with the sun aglow in her face, with her hands cupping her little taza of chocolate like a little girl, she told me that today more than 2 billion people raised to believe that Maria Magdalena was a whore are perfectly happy and delighted to recognize and celebrate her as a saint. And at that one moment, Sanders said, you see, it's a story of redemption. And I see the same thing happening with our Magdalena. The river gave us everything: cumbia and coca, bogas and bolivar, aviation, transport, commerce, music, our culture, and even our freedom. And yet, in the same way that the church slandered Maria Magdalena, we have soiled the river, turning an artery of life into a conduit of death. We declare it beyond hope, its condition irredeemable, absolving ourselves of any responsibility for its fate and well being. We turned our backs, she said, on the river that gave us life. But to deny the Rio Magdalena is to deny all that we are as Colombians. And then she said, Maria Magdalena too was condemned until history took an unexpected turn. Now she's a symbol of love, loyalty, and grace. Can't we do the same for the river? And at that instant, a small yellow bird landed on our plate, pecked at the crumbs, and then flew off into the cloud forest. Thanks very much. That's a Zoom applause.
Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Wade.
Yeah,
That was-
the wonderful thing is that this sort of quixotic idea of cleaning up the river has caught on in Colombia in a very powerful way. It's one of the reasons that Juan Manuel Santos very generously made me an honorary Colombian citizen. And one thing we've learned from COVID, of course, is the resilience of nature. Do you remember those wonderful scenes of wild boar in the streets of Barcelona, Caiman blanketing the beaches of Baja? The Himalayas shining for the first time in a generation over the cities of the subcontinent, Karachi and Kathmandu and Delhi. Rivers like the Medellin running through the center of the city, looking like a trout stream. The resilience of nature is amazing. I mean, and I write in the book of two other rivers, the River Thames in London, for example, in 1967 declared biologically dead by the Natural History Museum. Today, it is alive with 125 species of fish. Dolphins can be seen beneath the bridges of London. The River Huntsed outside of New York was so dead that it was said that you could tell what kind of car the GM was manufacturing in its plant at Tarrytown by the color of the river. And when Bobby Kennedy and the fishermen simply got people to stop throwing crap into that river, the river became reborn. And today it's the richest fishery on the Atlantic shore of North America. I mean, the heavy metals are going to take another century to dissipate, but children can play by the river. Families can picnic, they can swim in the river in a way that would have been unimaginable. Humpbacks have been seen at the mouth of the river from 52nd Street in Manhattan. So these rivers have an incredible ability to recuperate if they're just left alone to flow. And so everywhere we went, the message from the people was, we must clean up the river if we are to clean up our soul. And if we clean up our soul, we will clean up the river. And it's grown in this sort of powerful way in Colombia. And that's the next step, is to actually implement this and send a message to the world that while the world may be falling apart, Colombia is falling together.
Wonderful.
I am sure there are people who would like to ask you some questions, Wade. I know I'm one of them, but I'm wondering whether those who would like to either make a comment or ask a question could put up their hands. Either it's probably easier if you go to the reaction box and you'll see a little thing that says raise hand. It's easier for us to see you. And then we can go on from questions. I can see Robert, for instance, has his hand up right now. Robert, would you like to go ahead?
I love listening to you talk. As a matter of fact, listening to you talk is like listening to a great musician, and it conjures up images and realities that perhaps I hadn't thought of before. I'm also very interested in what you say about the life of a river. I lived on the banks of the Red River in Winnipeg for a while and surprised a number of people by swimming. But I discovered that at the south end of the city, in spite of all the other places the river had been, it flows north, by the way, the river was fairly clean and I could swim there. But as it flowed through Winnipeg, I learned that because of the things flowing into the river, it became quite seriously polluted.
Yeah.
But the magical thing was, by the time that water reached Selkirk, it had cleaned itself up. And what I learned was wetlands and a river has an enormous ability to heal itself if it's given the chance.
Well, for example, one of the optimistic things, Robert, about the Rio Magdalena is that a huge percentage of, obviously one major problem is human waste. The Magdalena Valley, or the drainage, is home to 80% of Colombian people, 80% of the economy, and obviously 80% of the industry, and all the human sewage that goes into it. But the biggest source of pollution is the Rio Bogota, that of course is born in these pristine paramos and above, in the mountains above Bogota, but then it flows through a city of 9 million people. And by the time it falls over the waterfall of Tequendama, where the Muisca used to cast themselves to become transformed into eagles, the river is biologically dead. But the amazing thing is that falling about 40 kilometers down to the Magdalena at a city called Girardot, the river has already begun to rebirth itself. I mean, rivers are unbelievably resilient. I mean, one of the things that's always useful to remember when we get pessimistic about the environment is that if you took the entire hominid lineage, I don't just mean Homo sapiens, and I don't even mean our progenitor Homo erectus, but go right back to Homo afarensis, roughly 3 million years ago. If you take that whole lineage and applied it to a 24-hour clock as to the history of the earth, our entire human lineage would not occupy a second. So in other words, the weed will win in the end. The earth will rebound. Whether or not anything like a human being will be around is another question. But the resilience of nature, which we've seen in COVID, as I say, is a very positive and hopeful thing. And these rivers can, and people all around the world have done it. I mean, the Rio Seine going through Paris, people have brought a new attitude towards rivers, which we've done in Canada. I mean, you remember the famous river that went on fire twice in the 20th century outside of Cleveland. That river now is swimmable, so I find this kind of profoundly hopeful.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
There are other people who would like to ask some questions. I have one, if no one else is putting up their hand right now. I would love to know, I'm interested in languages. These Colombians whom you met, you spoke Spanish to them, but there must be a lot of other indigenous languages that are spoken.
Oh yeah, I mean, in Colombia, one of the amazing things about Colombia is that, I mean, obviously, like all through the Americas, we use the word decimate, but decimate means to kill 1 in 10. Smallpox destroyed 90% of the peoples of the Americas, often within a generation. At the time of European contact, we forget that there were far more native people living in the Western Hemisphere than humans living in Europe, right? So it was disease that swept away these civilizations, not Toledo steel. And yet in Colombia today, in absolute numbers, there are probably about as many native people as there were at the time of European contact. And one of the Colombia, like all countries, has made great strides. I mean, there are at least 57 ethnicities in Colombia with their languages intact. One of the things that's so very hopeful is how attitudes can change. For example, when I was a young student in 1974, when I would go up to live with the Arawakus, the parents of my friends at the National University would say, ¿por qué quiere vivir con gente sucia? Why do you want to live with the dirty people? Well, go forward a couple generations, and the last 5 Colombian presidents, as their first act before accepting their inauguration in the mantle of the presidency, has been to go up to the mountains to pay homage or respect to the Mamos, who have kind of emerged as a symbol of continuity and hope, a symbol of patrimony in a country that's gone through such agonies. People often say to me, that we have this idea that these indigenous people are sort of, quaint and colorful, but destined to fade away. That's not true. In every case, they're being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And that means if human beings are the agents of destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. And what do people need? They need their land. It's as simple as that. And in 1985, President Virgilio Barco said to a young friend of mine, Martin von Hildebrand, a young anthropologist, he just said, Martin, do something for the Indians. And the president really didn't even really know what he was saying. And in 5 incredible years, Martin did more than something. He secured legal land tenure to an area of land collectively the size of the United Kingdom for the 57 ethnicities just of the Northwest Amazon. Colombia has more like 90 ethnicities. And and behind a veil of isolation created by the absence of the federal state, because of the violence, a whole new kind of dream of culture was reborn. And so Colombia is really kind of, in many ways, I mean, there are areas in Colombia where conflict can persist, where people continue to get killed and so on. But in many ways, Colombia has been an exemplar for the world.
Thank you very much.
Now, those, for example, in the mountains of the Sierra Nevada, those four societies, Concuano, Wiwa, Kogi, and Arawako, they all speak Chibchan language group languages. So the Chibchan was the language of the Muisca, who were the kind of the Inca, if you will, of Colombia. You know, people forget, everybody thinks the Spanish conquest happened in Mexico and Peru. The truth is that more gold and precious jewels came from Colombia than either Peru or Mexico. And Colombia was a hell of a lot harder to conquer than either of those other two countries. But the Wiwa cannot speak to the Kogi because their language is mutually unintelligible. So they speak to each other in Spanish.
Okay, so Spanish is the language of communication.
Sure. Everybody speaks some Spanish, you know, pretty much.
Yeah, great. I can see another hand is up, and it's Milton.
Dr. Davis, could you tell us where your work is going to take you, where your work is going to take you from here?
Oh, well, you know, Milton, I'm always, you know, every reviewer who's ever reviewed a book of mine says, this book is quite a departure for Wade Davis, and they don't seem to get the pattern. You know, I never know when or how a book, you know, it's funny, given the amount of time you commit to a book, it's surprising how serendipitous is the manner in which they begin. I mean, you know, I was, there's a book I wrote called Into the Silence, which took 12 years to write. You know, for that one book, I bought 600 books and visited 57 archives. And yet that began just innocently enough when I was on the east face of Everest, trying to photograph clouded leopards and snow leopards for the National Geographic. And my friend, a wonderful character, son and grandson of medical missionaries in the Himalaya, Dan Taylor, responsible for the creation of the Chomolungma Nature Preserve, the binational park that encompasses Everest. We were standing on ground higher than any place in Europe, the summit of any peak in the Alps. And yet we were camped out on that land, but looking up at 2 vertical miles of ice rising to the South Pole from the east face of Everest, the Kanchung face, which is the last to be climbed. And Daniel just began in his inimitable way to speak of these Englishmen dressed in tweeds who read Shakespeare to each other at 23,000 feet. And I was hooked, but I had no idea that, yeah, that was going to consume 12 years. In the case of this book, Magdalena, what happened is that one of Colombia's most biggest corporate citizens, Grupo Argos, had been funding 2 friends of mine, who became friends of mine, 2 journalists from Medellin, to do a series of books in each of the 5 major regions of Colombia, you know, the Eastern Plains, the Llanos, the Amazon, the Choco, the forests of the Pacific, the Caribbean coastal plain, and the Central Cordillera. And these books were bringing together journalists, photographers, and botanists. And the idea of these books, they weren't to be sold, but to be gifted to every library in the country to send a message to a new generation of young people that their country wasn't a country of violence, but one of biodiversity. And they had asked me to come down to help them promote the Amazon volume of that 5-part series. And when we finished lunch one day, I just sort of blurted out, well, now you've done the rivers, why don't we do the landscape? I mean, I'm sorry, now you've done the landscape, why don't we do the rivers? And everybody said, sure, in that kind of magical Colombian way. And before I knew it, I had the full backing of the company in the early years to explore the Magdalena. And it just, the project just sort of grew. Initially, it was to be just a 7,000 word essay to introduce a kind of illustrated coffee table book. But once I got into it, it just had a way of becoming something much grander, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And the important thing about the book, incidentally, like President Santos, Juan Manuel Santos, the Nobel laureate, unsolicited by me, tweeted out to the world that every Colombian should read this book. And the reason he said that, I think, is that, the peace is precarious in any country recovering from that kind of war. And the biggest enemy of peace is pessimism, despair, negativity. And one of the things we don't realize is the impact that on young people in particular of being a pariah nation. Colombia was like, seen as the land of cocaine, and the psychological impact on young people was incredible. And they couldn't travel anywhere without being kind of made fun of, and it's such an embarrassment because, of course, the country has the greatest Spanish, the greatest institutions, the greatest universities. It is by far the most interesting country in Latin America. It's the most beautiful country with the most extraordinary people, the greatest musical traditions. I could go on and on. The greatest scientific traditions, the greatest literary traditions, and the biggest enemy of peace is negativity. And this book, it doesn't avoid, but it explains with empathy what happened, and goes on to say what the real heart of Colombia is. It becomes kind of a mirror. It holds a mirror to the people, showing them all that is wonderful about themselves and their land. And in that sense, as my friend Hector Abad, who's one of Colombia's great writers, said, he described the book as a love letter to the nation. And Hector, that was a wonderful endorsement, because Hector, who is Colombia's greatest writer, one of the two greatest writers, I'd say, his father was famously murdered. And, in all the violence, there have been maybe a handful of killings that have truly shaken the entire nation. And the death of Hector's dad, who was just an innocent doctor, a social reformer, much beloved in Medellin, literally brought thousands of people into the streets in mourning, and made his son famously conflicted. He had to flee to Italy. He's a beautiful man, incredibly wonderful father, and a great writer, but sort of publicly known to be conflicted about a kind of love-hate thing about his own country, which is quite understandable given what happened to his father. And he wrote on the endorsement for the book, that only Wade, and we're like really good friends, he said, only Wade could make me love my country again, which is a very beautiful thing.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Very, very kind of you to say that. Thank you.
I think that we're getting on towards 9 o'clock. I mean, we could go on all evening because you have so much to tell us. I'm going to ask Joe to speak to you. Joe, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks, Hillary.
go ahead and
Thank you, Wade. It was absolutely fantastic listening to you. Your love and passion for Colombia are just so tangible, and I think we all felt that. And we would love to have you back for another long sit down about other things. Thank you.
I'd be happy to come back anytime. It's, the thing is, I keep going on, this community has been so welcoming to Gail and I, and particularly, when I had to travel so much, and Gail had her shop, and I mean, she knows everybody on the island. I'm always like hidden away in my office writing, but the welcome that we've had in this island, and there's so few ways that we can give back. So if I can ever give talks for you or participate in any way with the Rotary or the school for that matter, all you have to do is ask me. I'll always say yes.
Wonderful. Well, you can count on it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It has been, I've been to quite a few countries in South America, but never to Colombia. And you've inspired us all to visit there. And you are telling us that in fact it's fairly safe to go, which is of course one of the irrational fears.
The only country, I might hesitate to go to the United States. It's about the only country in the world that I think it's of questionable, but Colombia, I would not hesitate to go to Colombia. It's, as I said, the only danger is you won't want to come home.
Thank so much. It has been really inspiring. And as Joe says, we'd love to have you back again sometime.
Well, thanks very much to everybody. And thanks, Hillary and Joe. And good night, Jillian. Nice to see you. And I'm sure I've put my sister to sleep, so I won't say goodbye.
I would like to say that we're in fact asking Rotary Club members just to stay on for a few moments because we need to talk about a few financial matters.
Great. I'll jump off then, Hillary. Thank you. God bless you all.
Yeah, thank you, Wade.
Thank you to the community for coming out, and it was such a great evening.